stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Can I get a motion to accept tonight's agenda, please?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So, I guess we have, at this point, comments for any topics that appear on tonight's agenda. So moving on now to item 4.1. Dr. Harrison, if you want to kick us off on tonight's roundtable, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. And tonight, before I begin in introducing the roundtable and the workshop experiences in which we'll all participate, I want to thank my administrative colleagues for joining us tonight. So we have representation from all of our schools except for Main Street School. Unfortunately, Ms. Chapnick had a family situation that came about. And then additionally, Mr. Sotile had a family commitment, and Mr. Hansen is at the sectional hockey game this evening. That said, we have a bit of limited staff, but a lot of folks here with a lot of great ideas to engage in the dialogue. So tonight we're excited to have a roundtable that's going to focus on two different areas. The first is going to be the use of instructional resources, and this is going to take on a bit of a different form than we have engaged in the past, and I'll explain some of that before I pass it off to Mary. And then following the instructional resource workshop, we're going to give a more traditional presentation associated with social work services here in the Irvington District. That'll be a presentation shared among Gail, Mary, and myself, and then we'll engage in dialogue in a traditional roundtable format. But to begin this evening, we're going to kind of venture into some different territory in how we function. So rather than sitting around a table with some guiding questions and maybe some readings that we would do in advance to kind of frame our thinking for the evening, it was very deliberate that folks come in kind of cold tonight and engage in a true workshop environment where we are going to have trustees interacting with administrators in an activity in and around instructional resources. So a community member may ask, well, why are we talking about instructional resources and why is it important to the school district today? So over the past, I would say, year and a half, the district has made some transitions. Board and my colleagues will remember that we made a transition in the purchase of science curriculum materials and instructional resources and Amplify for the last school year. And in doing so, they were primarily web-based resources. At that point in time, we began to engage in conversation about the changing face of the materials that we use in classroom to support student learning and in the delivery of instruction. Along that same period of time, our policy committee has been very busy over recent years reviewing and updating our entire policy manual, and we arrived at a policy that was targeted around the adoption of textbooks. And we wrestled with that policy in the policy committee and just seemed like it really didn't fit with where education is today, because it was a very traditional policy that spoke of that traditional classroom environment where every student's handed a textbook and the teacher has a teacher's manual and there may be a supplemental workbook that goes along with it. We're not in that space any longer. So the whole world has changed in and around that. So from there, the policy committee kind of kicked it over to the curriculum committee. We batted it around in the curriculum committee, and then ultimately, I think Ms. Proper then came and joined the policy committee as a guest that day. And we talked about it further and thought what we needed to really do was to engage around this and develop some common understanding. So that said, today, Ms. Ellis is going to lead us in a workshop where we're going to interact around the topic of instructional resources. She's going to have everybody active, talking, creating some work product. And from that work product, we're going to have some direction that we're going to take back to work first in our curriculum committee. The next meeting, I believe, is on the 11th. And then from there, we're going to play with the ideas that are generated today, make some recommendations that ultimately will trickle down to the next policy committee in drafting of a policy that will help inform the direction, the roles and the responsibilities of the Board of Education when it comes to the adoption of textbooks. And I do the air quotes around textbooks. So that said, Ms. Ellis, your first workshop that you're leading for us, so welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So as Dr. Harrison said, we know that the things that we use to learn in schools today look very, very different than the things that I think most of us encountered when we were in classrooms. And while we work tonight, I'm going to ask you to think about the following question. How does what we use to learn impact how and what we learn? So you can tuck that away for the night, okay? So
I'll actually write it up.
Would you like to do that?
I'll
That'd be
write it on
great.
the, once we begin, I'll put it on the easel behind you, Maria.
You
No,
sent
but-
a question.
Thank you.
It is.
Yes, yes, that's your central question for the night, yes. So rather than presenting to you our ideas about instructional resources and what might be used for kids to learn, we're going to ask you to generate that. So I'd like you to be seated in groups of 3, I believe. I think we're 12. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. We are 12 people. So if you could be in groups of 3 that are a mix of a board trustee and administrators who don't do the same work. I actually don't think we have administrators here who do the same work.
Well, it's
So
2 high school folks.
We do have 2 high, yeah, they're far apart. So, so if you could arrange yourselves. Maura, you want to move down a little bit? That would be useful. So we've got 3, 3, 3, 3. Terrific.
And Erin's going to be here in about 20 minutes.
Okay,
so
great.
she can
Great.
just-
So we'll have a group of 4 when she gets here.
Yeah,
Okay.
don't we need, let's see, it's a board member, administrator,
Yeah, so I'd say the 3 of you, the 3
no, I think we
here.
can just try it out, we just got 3.
I think that works.
I think we got it.
Juliet, Jay, Maria.
But then there's 2 board members.
Yeah, 2 board members. It's
I
going to
think
be that way.
it's
Gonna work that
unavoidable,
Yeah.
given the numbers.
It's an imperfect setup.
We're going to demonstrate our flexibility this evening.
So we are going to give you a pile of index cards. And what I'd like you to do in your groups is think about every single instructional resource that comes to mind. Chris mentioned textbooks. That's an easy one. Stretch yourselves, push yourselves. Think of every single thing you can think of that might be used in a classroom setting to engage a student in learning. You're going to put 1 resource on each card, okay? And I'm going to give you approximately 5 minutes to do that. You have a choice of regular black markers, or I know some of you get really excited about colors, sticky markers, whatever you like. Okay, so Chris and I will pass out your materials. You can get started, and I'm going to check back with you in about 5 minutes.
And I'll write the question on the easel.
Why don't you go do that, and I'll do
Okay.
that.
Let me,
Has an advantage.
that's a marker. I'm going to take this. I have it.
I'm an educator, but not a full experience, different type. I do confectionery. That's it. The writer with the spelling markers.
Intentional, Maria, they wanted someone to ask. Mary, do you want me?
In fact, it's not highly dense, but, you know.
If you need more, let me know.
So it's 1 per?
You guys review, and you can put that in the appropriate category.
Do you want to be the recorder or no? Pull them out and then we'll scribe. Okay.
I have terrible handwriting, so.
Are we all writing on?
You could do the obvious. Why not? The textbook.
Oh, we all have to write, okay. I was gonna say,
The internet.
Chromebook.
Those were so
Oh,
fun.
thank you.
Our recorder. We're working collaboratively. And
is that the licorice smell now?
Any research. Which one, we came up with Nick. Which one meant Nick? There we go.
So weird.
Books.
Cubes? Yeah, what are those called?
Traditional.
Oh, they're arrays, they're called arrays.
Google Docs.
See, I knew. Paper. So how are manipulators different from
Chalk.
Manipulators are used for an educational purpose in terms of helping students say math facts. Okay. Markers are for the.
Chalkboard. Well, interactive whiteboard.
Paper.
Yeah, so these manipulators are supposed to.
Here's.
Years.
So let's go tech
We saw that
podcast.
not too long ago.
I don't think we
I think you're supposed to put something.
How about
Physical objects / models?
You guys really like it here.
This is competitive, right?
Is that another one? Not too much, right?
I don't want to create any competitions,
So
but
either
there's some
hard
piles growing
copies
over here.
or,
I would do it separate.
right.
Oh, what's that?
Get like in math, right? TED Talk? It doesn't have to be right.
What are the things you guys do in the classrooms?
Someone else wants to scribe with markers, like you want to write with markers, I can't write with markers.
I mean, personal electronic device.
Novels?
What's that? Oh, I'm putting mini right.
Right.
Audiobooks or
Online games.
The library.
So formative
But
assessment.
also, what, yeah, like, I remember just sitting
How about
around
formative
Facebook
assessment?
just listening to them.
Yeah.
Oh,
K-A.
This is, unfortunately, so for me coming in.
K-A.
I would make it simple.
That's a good one. It's a very important one.
And
Can't
what
get this
about,
There, they love that. I was in formative assessment.
instruments.
There are lots of them, not just.
So it's three
We have
kinds
books
of
already. We got books already.
yeah, like,
Yeah, drawing, sketch.
I don't know what you call it, iBand,
Well,
digital music.
Athletics.
like,
And then
That could be, that's
online and art, give them two different.
I was thinking of
Just a reminder that the youngest learners in our school district are 5 years old.
Well, you
Hint,
could
hint.
have online databases.
household
I got it, I'll do another one.
kitchens and things like that.
I think Andrew.
They have an unfair advantage.
I'll get it, I'll get
Okay,
it.
no, no,
You just keep building your
no,
pile.
we'll have manipulate,
MLA source guide.
manipulate.
Try it.
Sure, why not? We're going for our third round of cards here.
You need more cards?
We're gonna need more.
Outdoor.
We brought like 1,000.
Yeah, see where it goes.
We forgot to tell them about the prize.
Yeah.
So what else?
my daughter.
We have to say like be specific, so I play like,
Manuscripts. Put that just as like
what are we saying here?
That's like virtual.
plays.
Kitchens, dolls,
5-1.
playground.
I was doing the wrong math.
For learning, what's the question? Just like a field trip. Screen. Field trips. Oh.
I did it here. She said.
What's the guiding question? Have to be in the class. How does?
What is the question we're answering?
Social media.
Think of it as
I'm gonna say it because it's
Well, I would write the Hudson River.
something,
You said in the
something.
classroom.
River is an excellent academic resource. Did I use it? Uh-huh. No, go.
Like town, like with the town.
So video conferences.
Assemblies.
Like all the intellectual institutions in New York City.
Yes.
You said Trump.
You
You
really
said
bought
Trump.
5 decks of cards? All right, now we're making.
I know, it's like the
Creativity.
pressure, like, yeah, I don't know.
You had your spurt, right?
We had a spurt. We said some field trips.
Members of the local community.
Oh, there's,
Right, so it's-
there's
is that right?
virtual suite. So it's there's meters too, right? What? We do that in middle school. What is it? virtual reality.
So Aaron, after you settle in, we'll.
Yes.
Community leaders, fire.
Yes.
No, but that's not virtual reality. Middle school. Well, I think we're trying to think is.
Oh, that's computer, what's it called? Google Classroom.
Mystery.
Mystery Hangout.
Mystery Hangout, thanks.
Highlighting
So I was gonna say, one of those two groups.
Video conferencing.
Right?
I would just say video conferencing.
When you say right here.
Either with this group, this
Oh,
threesome,
okay.
or the threesome on the corner with Maria.
Okay, I'll go on. I want to talk about what kids do when
I was thinking about that.
classroom.
and
Learning. So that's actually what they're doing.
M
Writing.
and
They're
I
creating.
did it before. NNEMONIC.
Activities.
Writing,
But we have trips, right? So like all these places in New York City, like.
pens, pencils versus typing on.
Yeah. You guys gotta get to work here. You got your third member now.
Mary, how we doing on time?
Doing well.
I saw the dance.
I'd like to just check in with you, and, because I'm feeling a little bit of a lull.
Hi, Aaron.
Oh, hello. Oh, could someone?
Could I?
Yes, should I move
Well,
to my
maybe
right or my
not,
left?
because no one's listening.
Seems to be a whole lot more room over there.
What is crafting? What's instruction? How, but
Crafting
remember,
is
we're
like when
supposed to be instructional.
Crafting, I would say crafting out. Crafting is like building models. Self-expertise.
Right, yep.
Yeah, it's certainly.
So that's like, almost like your coding. Coding is actually.
The most important resources in the whole building are the kids and the teachers.
Education.
Language.
You know, I was thinking of something science.
Every department is.
Speaking of natural resources.
We can think of, putting it on.
Socratic seminar.
Yeah, but that's not really, that's more of a actual tool. I'm thinking more of-
But just for this step,
Yeah, the content.
Call our card.
Because you're gonna be the reporter for the group.
Wait, so do you have to put
It's
this
fine,
in?
but you are charged.
Yeah,
There's attention to that. We'll talk about that.
we're writing down every word that comes to mind.
Your head.
Animals that dissect.
We know what we did. We pretty much wrote down every word that came to mind. Every word.
These are resources.
But they came in the context, so.
Okay.
Wrote down everything.
I think we interpreted the question pretty broadly. Yeah. That's good.
Parts, anybody?
So I can read all these words and someone else will give me context. What all these
I
means?
think our expectation is that you'll do both.
okay, if I could have everybody's attention.
Then you gotta know what to do with them.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, boys and girls.
Thanks.
Yeah, science lab. That was like
Your next step
that goes-
is to take all of your cards on which you've written your ideas about instructional resources, and please sort them into two groups. Go.
What are the groups?
What, any groups?
So what do we do? Tech versus.
For the critical thinking skill.
I think we should. Tangible
Two groups
resources.
based on of what?
No, we should do,
Right, so like.
okay.
What'd you do?
Pink and white.
Color. Great, now do another one.
Oh,
Tech and non-tech?
all right, do you want to
Tech
take
and
it with
non-tech?
her and I'll do what?
Read a lot as resource. Read a lot as
No, just do them together.
right, so it's like. Oh, we were saying virtual.
But what if there, but some fit in
I think
that
informative assessment is still.
That's not technology.
But it can also be.
I would say, well, I would,
Hybrid.
Okay. More carefully, because that can,
Right, right.
that can be both too. That's one.
resources, model, digital, everything.
Like something that's like individual versus text-based databases.
That's why I said, well,
Text-based databases.
I
Oh, just
like
like a
the idea
library. Okay, like a regular.
if there are like instructional resources.
That could be both.
We've run the gamut of like
One and the one and then.
real things.
But you said I
Non.
can sell it, and then someone
I mean, any
It's not a
vote.
computer.
No, right, that's what I'm thinking of, because like a lot of this stuff could be
Yeah,
digitized, right?
That's,
Right? Or one category of thing.
and that's.
Families and community and
I
self-reflection.
want to call that tech
Like,
here.
it's a
I think
different.
a lot of it is done.
Matthew,
Fair.
non-tech, I love game night. This is tech, and it's
Yeah.
That's all.
Okay, so wait, go through that.
Workbook, big books, novels, text.
I like some,
I just think we went a little broad with
I love back end.
some of these, like athletics movement, I don't know, like, that's not.
So we didn't put down any people, as we did, like teachers, we talked about.
We had community members and we had speakers.
Okay, fine. Members of the community.
Community,
We have,
teachers.
we have self-reflection.
School.
So what are your categories?
First tech and non-tech, I'm trying to make up for not contributing for 20 minutes.
I'm sure it'll come back, I think.
Oh, really bad, yeah, I'm
Go through them all, I'm gonna start sorting them.
I do. We have 3 categories right now.
No,
We fixed it. No, we had 2 categories and ones that we needed to think about as to what category to put them in.
See, one of the downfalls.
There's, Matt, there's freedom and boundaries.
Okay. He made them fit.
I had to make a choice.
Okay. Has everybody sorted?
Yes.
They're still working? Okay.
The tech is so colorful.
Choose another way to sort of cards.
Matthew, and now a third way.
I got
Put
it.
them all back together.
No one's having
Yeah,
as
yeah.
much fun as
New
us.
categories. Don't replay the same.
Now let's do yours.
Wait, now do what? 2 new categories.
Yes.
Another way to sort them.
So now this will be our third.
What is it? Go through the commonality of these.
Perfect. I like that.
Go.
things that have to be in a building.
Go look through the commonality of these so far.
I feel like we're playing a game show.
Well, just,
Smaller tile. But we're faster than they are.
I'm new to the group. Be gentle.
Building, not building. Not building.
I was thinking about the, our occupancy room for that one.
So,
Okay, so
The
in
tools
the,
and things.
one of the tenets of group work is
That feels like in the building also.
yes.
Matthew.
That's definitely building. That's sort of.
So this is a,
Things that are fixed.
The workbook is,
No.
We're fostering competition.
Maybe you could get a published national school reform.
Or that would only be
in the building.
whiteboards.
Graphic novels.
Out in the
Out in the
building.
building. Textbooks. Out in the
Like
building.
when we're listening to music. Really? You can't listen to it online?
That's a good point.
yeah.
Magazines, I think, out, I think out, yep.
Building, Matthew?
Writing with pens and pencils. Oh, either way.
Non-building.
Models are staying.
Maybe the question should be things that could be out of the building, that you can't do.
That's fair.
This one could be out.
Yes.
Well, they have the same.
Wait, this is out.
I think that one, oh, that was,
Not that often.
Is this in? Field trips supposed to be in?
No?
Yeah, okay.
dancing,
I think it could be out, so out, yeah.
speaking, speakers, speeches, things like that.
Could be out, could be both.
Commonality, right?
You said anything that could be
Just thinking as a
do out, we
teacher,
put out, right, okay.
Like if you ask me about like, what do I need to
Keep
teach?
them in.
That's how I'm interpreting it.
Could be out.
Garden design,
Being able to connect with local communities,
Clubs,
fire, police, and lions.
games.
they're saying in, right? Assemblies and
Happening with family.
speakers and
Using
members
the
of
garden
community.
or the garden, different spaces, including museums, in the town hall.
Okay, as soon as you are finished with that sort, guess what?
Sort again.
One more.
Yes.
Oh my God, one more, Matthew.
Yeah.
One more.
He tweaked one.
One more way.
Slide.
No, a fourth way, no.
Gentlemen,
Oh, you're in 4. Oh, because you did pink one.
Pink and white. Okay.
Oh, my.
Very valid category.
those questions.
How about student-led versus teacher-led?
Ooh, love that.
Yeah.
The library,
Right, yeah.
You notice you're very serious.
No, I missed that. It's what? Oh,
Do we need to get?
Student-led.
another two? Student one? Because they're the ones reading. Tell me, you're the,
These
you're
are all
at school, so you.
Not a good, whoa. I don't know. This is category.
A lot of this stuff is free.
Should we, you want to pass? We should pass.
Let's pass, let's regroup.
It's like a game show.
As a experience.
I like the teacher, non-teacher, but these,
Things that require literacy and things.
That's another way we could have grouped them, by the way, things that cost money versus things that don't.
auditory, auditory,
Or cost money.
Yeah, like, think like
multimodalities and stuff like that.
Like print versus people or something?
Parents teaching,
Doesn't look like you're doing something.
Versus media?
It was easy.
No. People versus.
What about, wait, let's go back to
Talk about doing things together versus alone.
Oh, that's
Group versus
good. Group
individual.
versus individual. Good, good, good.
Okay, so that'd be individual.
Individual.
charge me because I'm unemployed, because
If you can do it alone,
we'll put it alone.
right.
Yeah, right, like telling a story. If I was English teacher, I was helping you.
Cameras,
If your kid was in my class,
You could do it alone, but you might.
if your kid was in my class, and I would,
Yes.
alone,
You could do it alone, but, right, you could be a solo dancer or.
no,
Yes.
yes.
No, I think that would be.
Yeah, just say.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Very impressed with
If you're in it.
the thinking going on, the really, really interesting ideas that I heard. So we're now going to collect your sort categories. Chris will record them. And as we do, I want you to be thinking, going back to our inquiry question, how does what we use to learn impact how and what we learn? And we'll be looking for some themes that come out of this that we will want the curriculum committee and then the policy committee to be thinking about in terms of looking at our policies and our procedures for selecting what kind of materials are used in our classrooms. So who'd like to go first? Well, I think we start with the first sort that was over here, which was pink-white. I do.
You could say color-coded.
That was Erin's idea.
Oh, I see.
Very valid category.
Literalism.
Color-coding.
Anyone else?
We did resources that are, need to be done in the school building versus things that can be done independently on one's own.
So, in school versus.
In a building,
No, in a building, out of building, because later we do that.
Yeah, that's right. So in a building versus outside of the building.
what? What's this competition? What are we gonna have?
Matt, would you give us an example?
Sure, we talked about like public speakers, which we thought of as being like assemblies, as in-school thing, whereas like an online magazine could be something that can be accessed just as well from home.
Another group?
We talked about self versus other, and self being like metacognitive resources and managing your own learning versus everything else.
Give an example.
That was nice.
Example of metacognitive, sure. Reflecting on your own learning, students keeping their own graphs or charts of their progress,
Okay.
trying to reach their own individual goals.
Okay.
And then we talked about tangible and intangible. So tangible being like the apps, the iPads, the speakers, and then the intangibles being,
Trips.
and the metacognitive piece too, the self-reflection, a walk in nature, observation.
Roy G.
Well, but speaking of themes, we had a similar one, like yours is metacognitive, when we said experiential for similar reasons, and then we also said, we said tangible, and we said, I think we said tangible also. We also said tangible, so that was one. The first one,
Juliet, what was your first?
experiential, so some sort of experience. So an experiential
So some
instructional
themes are
tool, like a
emerging.
field trip, for example, versus something tangible, like a magazine or a book. That was one of ours. And then we had technology versus not technology. So technology, no technology was another sorting.
It's the comment first, too, like
Yeah.
We talked about resources that one would sort of by definition use as part of a group versus resources that you would use independently. A class text versus an independent text.
How about our group over here? We haven't heard from you
So
yet.
one of the ones we had similar ones, we had fixed or static resources versus ones that can be changed over time.
Ryan, could you give an example of what you mean by that?
So a book which is as it is versus something that's like an online application that would constantly update and push out new material.
Got it. Thank you.
Classified those as text or traditional works. Modern and non-modern. So in the initial sort, kind of just thought about them as these are text-based, these are
So text-based and not text-based?
more like static versus
Okay. Others?
What would, so I have
Oh,
text-based,
sorry.
how would I describe the other category?
Text-based versus really non-text. So, you know, something that is the written word
Adam's
versus
key,
something like a
text-based and
model
not.
or diagram,
Oh, right.
non-text.
So how did he?
Send it down.
Did anyone use a sort that we have not yet captured? Captured everything? Yes? Okay, great. What do you notice?
Besides my penmanship.
There's lots of ways to learn. There's lots of ways to learn.
There are lots of ways to learn, yeah.
Teaching is an incredibly creative art. As well as
Anything else?
In each of our sorts, both piles were substantive, so there's a variety of options in every division. So it goes to say there isn't a right way to do things.
There's a creativeness. I think it's a creativeness. A creativeness.
I also think that student participation in the learning sort of comes out of all that too, that it's not just all teacher-driven, but also student-driven. So,
I think that's definitely reflected in
Yeah.
what you generated and the way you sorted, for sure.
There's a fair bit of ambiguity as well.
Can you talk more about that?
Only that we, I think, at times struggle to come up with the categories that adequately got at our entire file.
At everything?
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay.
And the other kind of ambiguity is that you can't just bifurcate these things. That so when we wanted to have 3 categories, you were like, no. Things that are both
No, I was
sort of-
forcing you to do a dichotomy
Right.
sort.
Right, so that goes back to the
You know,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
sort.
nothing fits in necessarily one box. It's not easily categorizable. There's things that could be in multiple categories or things that may be off on their own. And it doesn't lend itself maybe to a, just dual sort.
We didn't categorize anything as a particular grade level or age tool.
Did anyone
I mean,
think about that?
when people shared, no one said anything like, this is for this level. Or
Right, right. Yeah, that's interesting. David, I think you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the exercise led us to observe that there's, regardless of how you categorize, there's a wealth of opportunities for both students to learn from and teachers to grab from in order to develop the most rich, rigorous learning experience.
And it seems like there's a commonality here, that everything, or maybe it's the way our brains work, went from small to large. We went from self to other to tangible to intangible. I would have flipped that to non-tech to technology, right? Individual to group, like everything, like we started here and then you have that. So the resources could go from small to big.
So in looking at your sorts and the themes that you've pulled out of that, what would you like the curriculum committee and the policy committee to take into consideration when they think about developing guidelines for the district regarding instructional resources?
I think that,
Yeah, I was gonna say, it has to be very broad, because it is, the one thing is, just even thinking back to when I was in elementary school till now, remember we used to run off the ditto?
Oh, yeah.
And I used to love doing that, because the smell. I mean, just thinking about what kids use to learn, what teachers use to teach, and just even our learning experiences. Like, back in the day, if it was nice, you would go outside and your teacher would read you a book. Now, we're going down to Matheson Park and using, our immediate area to learn. It's ever evolving, evolving. So it can't be precise, and you can't tie teachers' hands and limit them.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a loaded response, being that I'm on the curriculum committee.
You don't get to answer.
Well, I'm not answering, I'm suggesting for other people to, more than anything. To me, because of the breadth, as you noted, it seems that to focus on the what is less important than the how. Meaning, like, so for example, I know New York State, when they redid the social studies standards and thought about the new social studies framework, they really thought out how they were going to select resources for that, and sort of asking questions around, right? Sort of like, does this resource provoke, intellectual conversation? Does it integrate content and skills and things to that effect? I think is really more of an importance.
Okay, we captured that.
I don't know that it came out of our discussion or sorting, but, I mean, one of the ones we put was worksheets, and then we X'd it out, so. We're often hearing, as administrators or board members, why isn't the district doing this, or could the district do that? As we've seen, there's so many wonderful ways in which we can learn, but there's time in the day and effectiveness and what we want and what state, requirements are. So I guess there's, how do we create a matrix of, those, what makes it in and is featured and what we don't have as much an opportunity to feature. And those discussions have occurred over the years, and Dow's Lane had a trip to the circus, but then that was a great experience. Everybody had fun, but then there was a suggestion to switch it up and have it be more experiential and in school. And so that was an example of saying, well, this is a great experience, but this is what we want to feature in our school.
And by the way, that was,
I'm not sure how to capture that.
I was saying the same thing.
I think it's almost like a purpose. So it's what's the
Ah,
purpose?
being purposeful.
Purposeful.
I feel like we should thank the IEF for that, since they're also here tonight.
Well, I think there's multiple things. I think it's purposeful. It's also related to that goal setting, and then additionally, I think effectiveness. And so when we say, like, yes, you can learn from worksheets, but I think there's a belief that may not be the most effective or high quality learning experience. So that's maybe effectiveness. Yeah.
And to follow up on what Michael said, I mean, it's more of a overall thought than a question, but came with a very broad list, everyone. So there's lots of things on our list. There's only so much resources financially to purchase resources. So what is it from a resource standpoint that we want to have the most? What are the most effective? Where are we going in 5 years so that we're going to have resources that we want to be using down the road? Is it a textbook that may not be up to date 5 years from now, or is it something else that's more customizable? And what is it that we're looking to bring into the district with our limited funds?
Like, I mean, just to carry on what I was saying, there's a lot of questions that you have to ask about whatever the resource might be, right? And then there are the host of resources that are sort of less out of our, budget management control area. Is it, sort of like the more policy decisions within school buildings, right? Like, using the local areas and using trips. Those things don't necessarily cost money. There's an envelope that goes home, whatever. Right. I just, again, like, when I look at, so we go back to social studies textbooks, right? We talk about those things. What kinds of questions were asked in acquiring those textbooks, right? Like, do these textbooks provide scaffolded supports for kids across different reading levels? Does it offer the opportunity for teachers to expand and develop more rigorous assessments? Things like that, I think, weigh in on whatever it is you put in the pile, right? And so coming up with, I think, key questions to ask about those materials on the curriculum committee is important.
And I'm thinking about what you're saying, David, and what Allison, you said earlier about levels and how that didn't come up as far as grades being concerned, with regard to maybe what to think about for curriculum committee. I wonder, like, at the college level, for example, when we at the high school have college level courses, sometimes, like, I guess textbooks serve different purposes and books at different levels. And there might be, like, appropriateness of certain resources, whatever they may be, at certain levels more than others. And I think that's something, though it's interesting, our group included did not sort according to level. I do think it's important to consider, though there's value in all of everything in our pile, there's value at all levels. I think some more so at some levels than others.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So, if you told a social studies department as a principal of a high school, hypothetically, no textbooks this year, you're on your own, what are you gonna do? How does that, like, what happens then, right? So thinking about the level, I always like to think about what's necessary and what's not necessary. I always, like, this is the food for thought, like, what would happen if you did, just yank that away from social studies teachers, what would they then do, right? If I was a social studies teacher, and that was my area of expertise, I would have probably a wealth of stuff to draw from, like, plenty of documents, like, what's the gentleman's name who wrote the book, Mr. Barry, right? Like that, I mean, you have a man, right? Like, he could probably write up, and bring in documents and things like that, so I just, it's important to remember that.
We said that very thing to our world language department a couple of years ago, and they developed a 612 curriculum that was entirely their own making, so certainly that's, we've seen that happen.
Yeah, but I also think what you said is 100% true, but what your hypothetical is not realistic, at least not in our school district. We're not gonna come in one year and say, oh, you're not allowed to use the textbooks, and, there's always something there. And then, we think, okay, let's change this, we think we could do better. So then there's a process, but there is always something in place before it's changed.
The questions that we asked to make that change.
Right, and I think that's what you were getting at in terms of, like, what are the questions that the curriculum committee should be asking versus something like a policy. I think that is, broader, like, you could have essential questions, like, and budgetary, like you said earlier, Brian, that eventually does come down to the board and the board's responsibility.
Right, exactly.
But going back to your comments about grades, I think it always has looked different, upper grades versus lower grades. The needs are different, and so it's not one size fits all kind of answer. Going back to that whole idea of flexibility.
Sure, but I want to pick up on something that Dave said, because you could take a textbook out of a class and use other sources to teach the same materials. It's a question of how you design the curriculum. I think social studies lends itself probably, outside of ELA, most to it. You could use plays, novels, historical texts to teach about eras as opposed to a textbook, per se.
Correct, but we're never gonna say, oh, we're pulling your textbook and you gotta come up with your own curriculum. That's just what I meant by his.
Well, I defer to the fact that over the last 5 years, we've actually done that here. We've invested in Atlas over the years to develop, and days, curriculum days and planning days to do that work specifically.
To
right?
map it out, yes.
Right, so then the question should be asked, what do we need to purchase or acquire or bring on to support the level that we've developed, right? That's what I
Yeah,
would think.
Should we be buying 100 textbooks or 100 copies of Up to Sinclair's The Jungle? You know, it's what resource should we be?
And why?
Right, and why, exactly. But it's a question of what, at the end of the day, we're looking to bring in to accomplish that curriculum.
And I would even add, that it's a textbook, and then there's also online resources that we're paying for.
Right.
And that may or may not be being used. But we're buying site licenses, we're buying accounts for every single student. And when we pull data analytics, we're not seeing the usage. So having that textbook is in their hands, we may or may not know that they're using it, but having an electronic resource, we can actually pull that data.
But I also think some of that comes to equity in terms of students with disabilities and non-disabilities. And we have to be mindful of that and how those resources are then played out with students with and without disabilities. So I just think that's something.
So equity and access is another thing to be thinking about.
As well, you know, some families, you know, kids have access to devices at home and internet and everything else. And there are other families that do not.
But the
And
same-
they rely on the library and other, you know.
But you're talking about.
One of the things that the one-to-one at the middle school accomplishes by at least taking that out of the equation, giving everyone access to a device. So if online resources are going to be a more prevalent part of the out-of-school experience, that's something that needs to be considered, whether that everyone has access to that.
I'll add, Brian, like, just from my experience, if you, we talk a lot about rigor, right, in these meetings, when we talk about instruction, right? And with the administrators, you guys are always talking about, right?
always.
Date, right? So, when I think of, I just want to make sure, yeah, we do. So when you, it's like, one thing I know just as a teacher, right, is when you are progressing through a course of study, whatever it might be, right, whatever the resource might be, the resource has to increase in rigor as well. Because if we expect teachers to, at the beginning of a unit, to provide basic information and do recall work and then move on, right, and then as the unit draws to a close, really have more complex thinking going on, the resources used have to be able to support that complex thinking, because that's when, you know, most teachers, when they use materials that don't support the level of thinking that they want, is when they get the dreaded face of kids, and the drool and things like that. So it's again, important to make sure that we are choosing things, whether they're electronic or hard, that, and you know, maybe this isn't the time, but you know, textbooks don't necessarily do that, right? To a certain degree, they support certain areas, right, of the arc of learning, but after a while, you gotta move on. So it's not just about the one resource, it's about multiple resources.
I wanted to pick up an idea, but first I wanted to let you jump in.
I think to add to what Gail said and what Juliet was saying, I think we have to also wonder or keep in the back of our mind that resources are differentiated and individualized.
Thank you.
So there are textbooks that are electronic textbooks these days that have different levels within them. So it's not just like the old, you know, book, paper textbook. If it's electronic and you can go to a higher level, a lower level, take like a turn somewhere electronically to serve your needs and your learning purpose, I think that's an important consideration.
The fluidity is also with the modality of delivery also. So it's
That's what I
not
was
just
gonna
about the level of the text, but it's also about, you know, providing an audio version or videos that come with it. And certainly, actually, we didn't split up our cards based on solid state or fluid text, but we said we hadn't, because that was a good point.
Yeah, very.
And that those subscription-based products that can evolve as standards evolve, that can, again, like reach students through a number of different pathways are really interesting. I would strongly suggest it's a strong policy consideration that we have at least found a way to get that into the shopping cart.
And to your point, you know, even the modern day textbooks are getting more lean with QR codes and links to resources online anyway. So you're buying a book that's giving you maybe a guideline, but then you're getting the resources online that's giving you the supplemental tools.
Right. I think, you know, I think the key is making sure that those supplemental tools are being used, and whether we have the analytics to see that for whatever reason the kids aren't using them, is it a fail, and where is that then stumbling block to not having that level of participation?
Right, but I wouldn't want to see something where we default to technological provision of information because it's an easier way, well,
a more efficient way to measure how people are using things or how they're doing on things, because to a certain extent, technological provision of teaching and instruction can sometimes put someone at a certain level that is lower than the level they might have gotten to if they were using something like, let's just talk about it in the context of novels, where they would be able to push in a way with the help of a teacher in a way that wouldn't happen if they were being fed it through a device.
Well, actually, it could be a little bit, you could see it the opposite way, so we look
Yeah,
at
that's what I'm
students
saying, I
with
think you look at it
disabilities.
both ways. But there are also students with disabilities who prefer to work on hard copies, just as those who are better off with technological copies.
Because you're identifying what is their modality of learning and to support that the best way, and then you guide through that. So when you think about, you need both modalities to be able to access and assess what that student's
Well, and if
preferred modality of learning is.
If you have a first grader who's using manipulatives, then you have to have something you're holding, right? Otherwise, it's a digital manipulative, which is, I don't know.
Which is
annoying.
entirely different.
I wanted to, because we're talking about policy considerations, what I noticed on the top, I also think, just listening to everyone speak, that transparency and stakeholder involvement is really important, because as someone raises an idea, as we just saw, people weigh in and provide some other perspectives, which then inform the decision-making. So I think that you know, having a range of stakeholders, even though ultimately we trust the professional leadership to guide the process, and that having various stakeholders weigh in and provide input is really important. And certainly with major initiatives, to understand how they're occurring and what the direction is.
And stakeholders, I would like to add students.
Stakeholders, everybody. I mean, I would love to have teachers and
Because,
students here.
because I feel like a lot of, no, I shouldn't say a lot of, I feel like, parents report one way,
Yeah.
but students report another way. And students are in the classroom, and they're using the device, or they're reading the textbooks, or they're using whatever it is, whatever a teacher is using to teach them for the day, and certain things. And I also think there's gotta be a lot of choices, because, like using an elementary class, for example, you can have a particular year that they might be more interested in the technology, and other classes more like, maybe manipulatives or something to teach math, for example. Teachers need to read their classes and kind of have the ability to make decisions on how to teach, what to use to teach.
As opposed to those methods being dictated? Or
Correct. That there should be a
Yes.
lot of options.
I've heard a lot of things. I want to kind of shake things out, like what Maria said, and go back to what Andrea said, David and Brian before. That idea, like, that I'm hearing, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, there's been like that kind of differentiation between primary sources and then whether they're, Brian used the word supplemental or secondary or tertiary type resources. So when we think of, if we were to think of a traditional textbook or a tech book, and it could be a tech book, like Andrea said, that actually individualizes and personalizes based upon a student's reading abilities and their progress. But when we step back from that, there's always going to be that supplemental material that comes out of it. And that's what kind of brings me back to thinking about what we were before, that idea of teaching as a creative art. And I think this comes to what Maura just said a minute ago, right? And Maria said that idea that we're coming back over here and we're thinking about what the teacher does. This is the craft of the professional in the classroom. So there's going to be a time when there's a foundation of knowledge, and we're identifying the primary resource. But we rely on the professional using that creative art to determine how they're going to differentiate kids' needs. And Gail, I also come back to what you said about, and Beth as well, right? Accommodating different learning styles and different learning needs. So what I'm wondering, and I heard that said 5, 6 different ways, I'm wondering if we need to document something that speaks to something that is a primary resource versus something that is a supplemental or secondary resource. Because when we think of something that we're purchasing that is going to be used as a primary source of knowledge, and I'm leaving that very broad like we said we would, versus versus buying a novel? Does the board, do you want us coming to you and saying, we're going to approve this novel that's going to be read by a group of 15 kids or 5 kids? Or is it that broader piece and understanding that the teacher, through their unit development, is identifying the approach and the strategy that the primary resource is going to be used to inform thinking, inform base foundational knowledge, but where the actual thinking happens is going to go out from looking at primary source documents. It's going to be looking at those in-school, out-of-school experiences. I saw over here you had peer, right? The idea of what they're learning from one another and the level of engagement from their peers.
So I know in Atlas, there's a whole section in the planning template that speaks to resources for that
Yes.
particular unit of studies,
Yes.
right? And so like, I know that's an area where you're talking about sort of that palette, right? Just as an example, like I just know there, almost, when the Common Core came out, and now with the NGSS or the state science standards, they published these rubrics. They're rubrics for choosing instructional materials.
Yeah,
And those rubrics ask a lot of these questions, right? Like, so for example, I know that the science program that we use meets all these, right? Because the Amplify meets all of these because the work was done using this. There's like a whole thing. But you know, they ask questions like, do these materials engage students in authentic and meaningful scenarios that reflect the practice of science and engineering as experienced in the real world? And I would almost bet if we went to look at the Project Lead the Way curriculum, which fits into sort of that little bucket, right? You could look apply it to that. You would be able to say yes, right? You check that box off and sort of like, I think as a curriculum committee, we should do something akin to sort of working together around not using these rubrics verbatim per se, but sort of, you know, culling really key questions from them.
Identifying those attributes of materials that we value, that are important to us.
I think it would create a very sustainable process for this board, future boards, and in collaboration with administrations, right, down the line to sort of engage in this very constructive dialogue using a base set of questions that address all the things that you said, Chris, right?
Yeah, I like that you brought it back. I think we said something like that sooner. So I wrote 4 criteria for material selection, key questions to consider. Again, I just wrote that because there was a number of ideas being suggested. And I think if we're looking to frame that, I think, Dave, you may have given us an exemplar from which we could identify.
The rubrics can inform that.
Those broad questions, to come back to our first bullet, the broad questions that we're looking to address.
Well, you've certainly given us lots of food for thought. I appreciate that.
Throw a couple
May
more
I,
things in?
may I add one more thing? Oh, you have something to
No,
just one more thing. I'm just curious how we collaborate then amongst all of the different schools, so how this all gets collaborated and synthesized from on a K through 12 basis. It's like when I think about ELA or math or things like that, there's a continuum that goes on from kindergarten through 12th grade, so it's not just about the 9 through 12 expectations, it's about the expectation once you get to 9th grade of where you need to be. So I think
The vertical articulation
that,
is
yeah, I
another
think that that's an important part of it too, so we don't just silo it within the high school, the middle school, at K through 3 and 4 and 5.
Well, and just because we've seen this too, or not necessarily here, but I've learned about it in other districts. In the articulation, you have to continue to respect what we talked about earlier, which is the differentiation, the difference between the learning levels. Because sometimes you say, this is what we want to achieve by grade 12, but if you do the logical backwards plow, when you get to kindergarten, you're like, well, that doesn't really work for kindergartners, so you have to, you gotta respect that.
The new standards do that nicely.
Oh, good.
Yeah, they do,
In science.
in all of them.
Yeah. The other thing, which is, because we bring it up every board meeting, is just a process for understanding, I guess we use effectiveness, so maybe that covers it, but just understanding, is this achieving the outcome that we hope for, the goal or purpose that we hoped? And certainly in a classroom, you know, a teacher with their, you know, as you were referencing, Rubicon Atlas can say, is the assessment matching up to, you know, what the instruction is, and then at an administrative level, you know, we've been looking and discussing how you're doing that on a school level, and then hopefully we as a board understand that as well.
Because ultimately, you know, New York State education law, board members are supposed to approve all of this.
Correct.
So, you know, it's not just, there has to be a process put in place, that it's not simply a
goes through the schools, it's brought to the board, and it's just like, here, this is what we're doing, and it's like a rubber stamp. Like, there's gotta be a system in place that it's all, you know, kind of like an assessment and shown to the board. This is why we're doing it. It meets all this criteria. These are the funds, and, you know, gets shown because only some of us are, for example, on the curriculum committee. So some of us have more firsthand knowledge than others.
And as we take all of this into consideration, when we think about how we want to look at policy as well as the procedures about how we select instructional resources and which ones and how they go to the board, what kind of documentation, what kind of explanation would be provided to you so that you had a solid understanding of the thinking behind the instructor for why they wanted that resource and thought it would best meet student needs. So I think that's, again, you've given us tremendous food for thought as we move forward.
I'm sorry to jump in. I would just like to see that Maria's comment is, I'd just like to see that Maria's comment is documented. Because part of why we're having this discussion at the board level is a question about what we approve or don't approve. So I think approval process is a part of the policy consideration.
That- which is where we go.
You spoke about the policy committee and about documentation needed to prove. I just want to say again that the policy should be as broad. It should define the process, but it shouldn't, in my opinion, and as a member sitting on policy, it should not tie any building principal or any committee's hand in terms of you need to provide X, Y, and Z, because certain things might be documentations, other things might, you know, I don't know. Everything, it changes, right? So I think more specific as to the process, not necessarily what's the deliverable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, to wrap up, I think that's the key, is that policy is always going to be broad. That's where we start. But the devil's always in the details and how things are played out. And at curriculum, where we've struggled is, okay, there's a request to spend $20,000 on a textbook. Why is that the appropriate resource for that grade to teach that task, as opposed to a library of 5 different novels or whatever else may be, and understanding how that's going to achieve the goal, but also achieve that goal 5 years from now, so we're not reinvesting in resources continually.
Or amplify even.
Well, but what you're talking about, right, and you know where I stand on that, right? Okay, and I look at the assistant principals in the principal's room, this is a culture shift that needs to be undertaken in several, in a lot of classroom areas, right, where there's less reliance on certain things and more reliance on a variety of things. And that's not just, saying, here, do this. There's professional development that comes with that. So there's that's a thing. It's a culture change in a lot of ways. Like if you're teaching a global history regions class, okay, look, facts, there's much more fun ways to learn global history. It should be being employed. I'm not saying here, I'm saying in general, right? And those ways are often eschewed for, we need to follow this textbook because we have this breadth of things we got to cover, and we've got to blah, 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 blah. And that's a culture change. So when you can stimulate, rather, I was going to use the word force, but stimulate a culture change by having this conversation and saying, we're going to shift the way we practice using resources in our buildings. It's not about not yanking the textbook away necessarily, but saying, the textbook is here, but when I come in as an administrator, what kind of strategies are we working on to employ other resources, like Brian suggested, when you're studying, World War II in social studies class, are you collaborating with the ELA teacher, and are you reading Grapes of Wrath at the same time, right? Are you doing those kinds of things? The Depression, I meant, not World War II.
Yeah.
Right? We read different books.
Yeah,
Like in high school, that would be an appropriate collaboration.
I like the book.
And that would then echo into teachers being creative and then saying, what kinds of stuff do we need to do that? Right, but that's down the line kind of thing. But what you're saying, Brian, requires not just purchasing power.
Right.
So I would say, I think that this is going to prove to be quite the learning experience for the board as well, to be able to see the process. And I think we've outlined a lot of great standards, and we think about that culture shift, Dave, I would argue that that culture shift may apply to some individuals and some departments more than a holistic philosophy about education. So when I think about our rounds that we do as a team when we go through an elementary school, I can't think of a time where there's a textbook sitting in front of children. But then I can think that, to Juliet's example before, when we think about some college courses that our students are actually taking, there are textbooks that are mandated by the particular university that that course is affiliated with. So there's going to be kind of a mix and match here, and I think this is going to be a real opportunity for some learning for everybody to be able to see what is happening and that connection with what we're doing with that K-12 articulation and alignment that I think that comes out. So when we go through and we think about all these different steps, we've identified process, we've identified presentation of rationale, we've talked about the purpose that it's going to serve in the classroom and the value that it provides, but there's also going to be that linkage to what happens to the global picture of what the instructional unit, the scope of a course curriculum is during the course of the year. I think like we look at this, there's a framework that any of us could walk away and really write an outline for what a policy would look like, and then put a group of us in the room, we could fill in all the necessary language around it.
Expect it tomorrow.
It's already done.
I'm not gonna, Mary and I are gonna sleep tonight. So, but as we said, I think the next step is, and obviously Mary and I will do some work and we'll chat with our colleagues at AC next week. But our next stop is going to be on the 11th, that curriculum committee. I think we have like a real good
start.
agenda item here for where we go. This is like great work, good partnership for us here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
So on to topic 2.
Topic 2.
Staying in our spots.
So can we just note that we won also?
Like quantity, no competition this time.
A very small pile.
In the update. Yeah. So as I said at the onset, part 2 this evening is a more traditional presentation, which I anticipate not being that long or cumbersome. It was provided to everybody in the room in advance of today. We want to thank certainly board leadership met with Mary and myself a couple weeks ago to kind of talk to some of the questions that were out there, and we sought to address them this evening. We also created a comprehensive document of additional resources that are to serve as a support and not necessarily to be referred upon throughout the conversation. So tonight, as I said, we are going to start off with conversation about how does the school system support social, emotional, and human needs of our students. So that said, we have some objectives that Mary Gale and I set for us this evening, and that is first to review our commitment to SEL, recognizing that the work of a social worker and an SEL program are kind of like a Venn diagram, where there is overlap, and there's things that happen that are exclusive of that, but there are places where there's certainly alignment, where each individual or teachers all play different roles here, and we have some tremendous visuals that we think will speak into that. I want to speak about our commitment to social emotional learning across the district and the work that we're in the midst of. And then we want to dig into the roles and responsibilities of the cadre of mental health professionals that we have available to us in our school district. And then in that process, we're going to review some related data and then talk about a proposed configuration for mental health staff, and then, of course, engage in dialogue. So that said, when we think about where we are, we're certainly committed to developing a well-aligned, thorough program that is articulated throughout all of our schools. And one of the first steps in this process is coming up just this Friday. We're going to have Castle is going to come in and spend the day in Irvington And based upon their time here in district, based upon the countless documents that they've been reviewing over the months leading up to Friday, they are going to look for opportunities for program growth for us. They're going to look for that level of alignment. They're going to produce a report that's going to have a series of recommendations that will inform the district's future work. That said, they anticipate a turnaround of about 4 weeks for that process. So growing out of that, once we receive that report, we will go into a planning mode as a school district. That we're going to review and consider all of the recommendations and develop a multi-year action plan to ensure the implementation of a real comprehensive and, again, well-articulated program. For this work, we're going to put together an SEL committee that is going to guide this work, and I want to just reassure everyone that that is going to be a stakeholder-based committee that's going to have voices of many folks involved. I was recently at a workshop 2 weeks ago, and I attended a number of sessions related to the social emotional needs of children. And the schools that seemed to be the most successful, or districts that had been the most successful, were those that were really dialed in and engaging their students and hearing back from their students about what their needs were and how the system worked for them and the types of enhancements that could be had. And then when we think about budgeting, as I said in the previous bullet, we recognize that it's going to be a multi-year plan. So as we look forward to budget and timing with all this, and it's unfortunate because, as everyone in the room knows, we had originally scheduled the visit for the fall, but weather conditions forced them to cancel the trip, and the next available day they could get to the East Coast was this Friday. So we'd like to take an approach similar to what we did this year, where we actually put in a placeholder of funds to be able to support needs that may grow out of that. So those needs could be multifaceted, right? It could be purchase of materials. I think one of the most obvious areas is going to be professional development. And I want to caution everybody that when we see the number of $25,000 and we think professional development, that question may jump up to say, well, gosh, is that enough? Well, this is one pot of money that we're putting aside specifically for this purpose. We have other substantial professional development funds that will be available that we can draw from to be able to support this initiative as Mary works with all of our colleagues to prioritize for the upcoming school year. So when we think about where we are, there's certainly this landscape that exists around us, whether we want to say nationally or globally. And I feel like, over the last couple of weeks, obviously, the coronavirus has been what's dominating the news. But aside from that, how many stories have we heard about the stressors that are facing our children today? So we have a few slides here of information, and you can see the source, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and recent research in 2019, so we're not going back in time. But thinking about high expectations and the pressure to succeed, and thinking where that is, and how much of that is intrinsic, coming from within the own child, that is coming between and among peers, that sense of competition, expectations that grow out of the school culture, so what we're doing as a community, so educators, students, the role that homeschool plays in this, and expectations that may exist in a household. But some of this data is really, really staggering, that kids feel overwhelmed with all that they have to do. In 2016, 41% of students said yes, that they're overwhelmed, compared to 28% in 2000 and 18% in 1985. That a world that feels threatening and or scary. So you think about where we are, right? Violence that's happening globally, shootings in schools. Now, is it going to become a global pandemic? To think of health risks that are out there and about. So you think of that idea of the news and the media and how that's affecting all of our students' lives, or how it affects us as adults, and we transfer those fears and those emotions on to our own children. And that idea to think about, where do kids begin to feel safe, and is that safe environment at school, is that safe environment at home, and how does that translate to students feeling having that level of severe anxiety. And then the effects of social media. and thinking that how our kids are consistently connected to devices, to social media, and that regardless of the different levels there, there's effects on self-esteem and one's view of what's happening in them around the world really causes challenges for our youth. And when we look at this data, it certainly speaks to our teenagers, but we know it trickles down, right? So we think about how many children have smartphones at young ages, how many kids are engaged just in reviewing media and watching the news and how that affects their lives. But we know that these are having tremendous impacts on the lives of our students. So that said,
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harrison. Thank you. One of the things that was in the presentation before was our guiding question for tonight that we're going to be coming back to a couple of times today. And it's really, how does school system support our social, emotional, and human needs of its students? And we look at that, we're going to be looking at this through our tiered approach. So most of you know about our RTI and Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, and that's how we're going to talk about our social, emotional needs through tonight. And when you look at the tier, our bottom Tier 1 is our classroom instruction. And most of the people that are delivering this system are your classroom teachers and your school counselors. They're providing that core instruction around social emotional learning. Where we start to see where our social worker and other mental health professionals start to play in is through the Tier 2 and Tier 3 system. So when you look at Tier 2, it is still your school counselors, your psychologists that now have entered, and your social workers. And they're providing a much more targeted small group intervention. So when you think about our social worker and our Tier 2, it is definitely for a shorter duration of time and very targeted for that area. And Tier 3 is obviously our most intense needs, and that is predominantly our social worker and our school psychologist. Okay. Under our current model, we are blessed to have school psychologists at each building, and obviously at Dow's Lane and the high school we have more than one. And then at the elementary level, this is our second year with a school counselor. At the middle school, we have 2, and at the high school, 4. And then obviously at the campus, most predominantly at the high school, is our student assistance counselor. And we're going to talk about everybody's roles throughout, but that is our current structure with one district-wide social worker. So I know from previous work we've done last year, and we'll talk about it more again, tonight is what is the work of the social worker from a district perspective. So a school psychologist is somebody, it's an individual that meets with children and adolescents to work through their behavioral health and learning needs in a collaborative manner with educators and with families. And the role of our school psychologist is, as what you can read, but we really want to target that it is very much from a CSE mandated standpoint predominantly. There's testing that's involved when we have students that are referred to the committee, and they perform these various tasks. And we're going to talk more about them in various levels in their tiered system. But that is what the role of a school psychologist is. Now, we talked about an elementary and a secondary counselor, and the school counselor really addresses student needs from an academic standpoint and a social emotional standpoint, and they're helping to design and implement those Tier 1 lessons and supports to help with the social emotional learning of all students. So when you talk about what their role both at the elementary and the next slide talks about at the secondary level is this small snippets of time in which they're working directly on an individual basis with students through a coaching or a counseling component, especially at the elementary level. They are in classrooms delivering lessons around resilience, self-reliance, all of these pieces that we are valuing in developing our students' social emotional learning. And the addition at the secondary level obviously is a little bit more of college counseling, providing transitional supports as we think about what our post-secondary experiences can be. Okay. Our student assistance counselor is really a person that is knowledgeable, obviously, about alcohol, drug, and tobacco prevention and rehabilitation. But they also are here to help in supporting building school-wide and district-wide coordination about preventative ways and measures for students Because really, obviously, we don't want them having addiction issues. It's really getting to students early and preventing it. So that is really their role in our school. Here with us, they also do provide at-risk support to students, all students, and obviously those that have been identified through our administration, families. You know, we have parents calling, I think my child has an issue. Our student assistance counselor is at the ready with questions and really helping to assess those situations for us.
And I would add, in that a lot of these relationships, there is oftentimes self-identification, where students are coming forward to the student assistance counselor indicating, I think I need help, or peers coming forward and saying, my friend needs some support. So it's really created a safe space that occurs in the school where there's many levels of need that are being addressed, from the whole mental health component to substance abuse, domestic violence, families challenges that happen within that space. I do want to add with this that we have one student assistance counselor, as Gail identified. It is 80% of the time dedicated to the high school, 20% to the middle school. And that 20% is funded by our partners at IASC through the grant. So the district only carries a percentage of the cost associated with this.
And what Chris talked about is, I would just add to that, is the fluidity in which all of our mental health professionals work, right? So there's fluidity with, social worker, our school psychologist, and I would add that our administration also is part of these conversations and this work on different levels and for different reasons. And then really our role of a school social worker. And as we wrote this slide, I think we had a hard time just putting the few bullets that are here because it is very encompassing. And we're going to talk more about that as Mary and I talk through the data and really understand what is in each tier of the work that our current social worker does from a district-wide standpoint.
So to help look at the demands of the social worker, what the district has done has tracked the social worker's actions over the last 3 years and categorized them into 3 different types of actions or interactions. And the numbers will show you are indicative of the number of times that particular interaction has occurred, not necessarily the number of students who are impacted. So in some areas, there may be a small number of interactions over a large number of students, and in others, it may be the opposite. It's a large number of interactions over a smaller number of students. So tonight, the data, that we're showing you is numbers of interactions. And we're looking at it in 4 different areas: student support issues, family support and outreach, staff collaboration, and crisis management. Gail and I are going to go through with you specifically what each one looks like, and then show you the data for the last 3 years.
Sorry.
Go back, sorry. I want to say up front, we have some challenges with the data, and I believe when we look at data, we should acknowledge how good it is. We know that in 2017-18, due to some changes in staffing, the social worker took on some additional responsibilities that in other years they may not have had. And our 2019-20, clearly we're not finished with this year. We took a midpoint in January and have doubled that number to actualize it over the rest of the year. And as I said, I want to be very upfront about our data. I love this quote. All models are approximations. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So I think when you look at data and you understand exactly what it is that you are looking at and recognize its limitations, it can still be tremendously useful. So the second part of this quote, however, the approximate nature of the model must always be borne in mind. So as we look at the data, we want to be upfront about that. Okay.
So in really defining what each of these 4 categories that we've been collecting data over time, we have put them each in terms of what that looks like within each tier. So again, in our tier 1, our work, Gina's work has been around setting behavioral expectations, identifying students for tier 2 and tier 3 whether it's small group coaching, that is the role of participating in meetings that are helping to identify what additional supports a student may need. When we go to Tier 2, from a student support standpoint, we're looking at check-in, check-outs. We'll go over what that is when you have questions later, but really students are having some trouble either coming into school, or some issues are coming up. They're really providing that quick check-in, get ready for the day, get into class, and obviously checking in, how was the day at the end of the day. There's parent training that's involved, and really helping us to work through our school refusal components that we have. And in our Tier 3, risk assessments and coordination with hospitalizations for students that unfortunately will have to go to the hospital for various reasons.
So when we look at the data related to student support issues, you can see that pretty much with the exception of the middle school, we have seen from last year to what we anticipate for this year, a reduction in this aspect of the social worker's interaction with kids. You'll see as we go through, this is balanced by an increase in other types of interactions.
So one of those categories is family support and outreach. Again, through our tiered systems. In our Tier 1, we're responding to parent concerns. A parent is calling for a couple of reasons, and we could talk about what those are. And then also helping those families that children may be having some challenges with their behavioral, really helping parents understand what those behavioral expectations are, so they're building that homeschool connect again, which is one of the roles of a social worker. In our Tier 2 from our family support, we're talking about IEP mandated parent training, which is different than counseling. We'll talk about that. And then managing and coordinating what we call our Bulldog Family Fund, or BFF as they're being called. And then our Tier 3 is a coordination of our mental health support in response to our risk assessments and hospitalizations. So when a student is getting ready to be released from a hospital, there's a lot of coordination and family support that a family needs and a school will need.
And as Chris mentioned earlier, the national data is showing a tremendous increase in stressors that children are experiencing, and that is shown out in this data in terms of the family and support outreach. Interestingly, the largest jumps are in our youngest students as well as in the adolescents.
I think when we talk about the fluidity of what a social worker does in touching all these components, that family support and outreach, their families' needs are increasing as their students' needs are increasing, from anxiety, self-harm, whatever it is for that student. That support that a social worker provides is instrumental in keeping our students in our schools, and that's the most important thing. So it's building that homeschool connection again that helps provide that safest environment for students so that they can feel successful in our learning environment.
Could I just ask a question, just to keep digging in a little bit on this? I mean, to see such a jump, what sorts of factors are driving this? I mean, in terms of...
Turn to our colleagues. I think our colleagues could respond with anecdotal information that could be helpful.
Andrew, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. At Dow's Lane, I would say it's life. I think our 4- and 5-year-olds are stressed, the parents are stressed, it's society, it's...
We're not in a recession, coronavirus hasn't hit us yet. I mean, what are the stressors in what's life?
I see our children nervous and anxious. We have some school refusals with 4- and 5-year-olds. We have children that cry, mom's not there, dad's not there, someone's out of work, grandma yelled, dad hit. There are some stressors.
I would add to that in that we're seeing a lot more domestic situations than I've ever seen in my career. And I look around the table, so every time that we have involvement with CPS, everybody reaches out to me. So I get that district view of what's happening. And so that's the engagement with the school administration as well as our social worker in each of those cases, and in some cases school psychologist is involved based upon that child's particular needs. But the instances of domestic situations in the home, instances of some form of neglect, so whether that's a child being properly cared for, and so there could be a youngster being left home, supervised by someone that's inappropriate, a child not coming to school, so you're looking at educational neglect. There's many, many examples, and I have to say, it's like off the charts. So when we refer to that other document, the 11-page supplemental document, so this is our primary resource that the board would have to approve, and the other's a supplement, that when you take a look at that, there's an outline for all that's involved in a CPS situation, that when we look at these scenarios, there are so many pieces to it, and it just doesn't end with a CPS call in those cases where it's needed. There's layers of supporting the student, there's the engagement with the family, the restorative process that the school has to go through with the family to build that level of trust again, and then the ongoing support for both child and family to get through whatever the hardship may be. And so Matt, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I think that the connection between the anxiety that Andrea was sort of referencing at Dow's Lane, it certainly spikes in this area for the high school because we see real high frequency of students who are unable to get themselves into the building on a regular basis, and families who need support in developing strategies to help get that machine rolling in the morning. And we watch that number climb steadily every year that I've been here. And now, the other piece that you talked about, having that support that's in place even after attendance recommences, that those protocols and those practices at home stay in place, that as things get comfortable, bad habits don't reemerge, the family connection for anxiety is massive.
I just want to add,
Just to follow up on that, I mean, there's been a pretty, dramatic spike over the last couple of years, it seems. I mean, is there some root cause that we're seeing or that we've been able to identify in terms of?
The earlier slides Dr. Harrison showed highlighted the ones I would have picked out. Social media, certainly. The intense competition, academic competition that we have in Lower Hudson Valley, certainly. I think we have, a complex social divide in the building that I think sometimes highlights the haves and have-nots here that makes it difficult for some students. There are a number of things that create those challenges.
And I just want to add, can I just add one thing? I was at a conference today about mental health and the law, and some statistics came up, but what was really pervasive, and we were all over, we were in Poughkeepsie, and there were people from all over, the national norms on mental health are staggering. They're increasing all the time. That is our reflection, because it does trickle down from elementary. We have preschool, we manage preschool students all the way to, to grade 12. Until the mental health component from our nation helps, until we can support that, we're going to have these issues. And I think we have to recognize what we as a district can do and want to do to support that, and what does that structure look like, because that anxiety is not going away. That mental health right now is not going away. And if we recognize that and build in support so that we can mitigate it to the best of our ability, that is our role and our goal.
Can I ask, sorry. Okay, just two questions. When, around the Dow's Lane spike on family support, would that not also translate to an increase of student support? Because we're not seeing, the student support went down, family support went up, but based on what I'm hearing, I would think CPS calls would also translate to increased student support. So I'm surprised not to see that.
We're going to bring it back to the tiers in a second, but what's really good about the elementary school and the work that we're doing, or buildings are doing around the social emotional, that tier 1 piece, is when those families are reaching out, that's the time. Our social workers swooping in, our psychologists swooping in, so that it's not impacting that student from an immediate standpoint of that social emotional. But then I also want us to bring back that our school psychologists and counselors then can be and are addressing those individual student needs in a little bit differently. I think when you look at family support, how a family reaches out to a building, we had a phone call today, a parent didn't know who to speak to, they had an issue, when I think started with a school psychologist, and it went to our social worker, and how we were able to circle back. So that student may not be feeling that immediate impact in that classroom, because we've been able to identify and give those families that support that they need, and I think that's the goal.
And I just want to say, if I may, Dave, just 'cause I want to build upon that we have to think of the reality of the difference in the structures from an elementary school to a secondary school. So that in an elementary school, when we think of that, that lower tier, that first tier of intervention, you have that classroom teacher that's the steady in the child's life almost all day long. And once a child arrives in the middle school, how many different people are a part of that child's life? So the type of intervention and the folks that are involved, it's going to escalate, because that common denominator is going to become not just the classroom teacher, but it's going to become a grade level leader. It's going to become the guidance counselor. It quickly moves into the mental health category, where the classroom teacher, utilizing the administration, the other mental health staff as a support, as a resource, is able to work with the family and the child in a different way than it would realistically be able to play out in a secondary school.
This is a very encouraging slide, seeing the yellow shoot up, but I think of this in terms of, obviously all the stuff that you spoke about, right, in terms of more tier 2 and tier 3. I think of tier 1, and I think of, like you just referenced, right, in the earlier years, there's lots of engagement, it's day to day, you're in constant touch with class parents, there's all of these things. You know what's happening in your kid's classroom straight through 5th grade, right? I don't know if anybody here at the table could corroborate that, but I think it's pretty, there's lots of family support at that tier 1 level, right? This is what's happening, this is why, this is because, this is what happened. Let's talk about this, can you meet on Thursday, can you, all of those things. When you get to the middle school, I don't know what happens there, but the culture there is so warm and loving, and the relationship between the teachers and the children is really great. It would be nice there to see that tier 1 intervention, the tier 1 piece, in terms of family support, like we started talking about last time, like how can we, I don't know why there's not a parent-teacher conference night, sorry teachers who are watching or listening, but there should be parent-teacher conference nights in the middle school and in the high school. There are certainly in New York City, and there should be an interaction, a forced interaction to a certain degree, where you have parents and there's certainly accessibility, right? There's not a single parent I know that can't get in touch with the teacher for the most part, and if there are, I haven't heard those stories. But in terms of more deliberate, right, to curtail, like in the middle school, one of the things I know that's really great is that because it's so interpersonal, that stuff with social media, all the different categories that you brought up earlier, kind of can get cut off at the pass, right? Because they're paying attention and they're really focused on those relationships as part of that middle school culture. In the high school, that kind of dwindles a little bit, right? Because now it's all about the work, or does it? I don't know. I haven't experienced it yet, so I can't say. But, just historically, right? Like gradual release, right? You become way more independent. But to see at that tier 1 level, small things that can be implemented, not just from a mental health standpoint, from just a regular build relationship standpoint, I think is really great.
So I think going back to the tiered system for family support and outreach, I think where you're seeing that in terms of the families with behavioral, we can change, that is where we're talking about at that tier 1 and building it through. So yes, and we are doing it through the tiered system.
And I would say before I know Maria, you have a point, but before we jump off of this, that idea of thinking about what's happening for tier 1 in the secondary schools. Earlier today, there was the extended master schedule committee meeting, and during that time, Juliet spoke about the work that the counselors are doing and the push-in work and the lessons that are occurring in the classroom are at a much greater frequency with much more purpose and focus than ever before. So when we think about an enhancement from an SEL perspective, when we think about enhancement of just straightforward tier 1, we're seeing that deliberate enhancement under the leadership of Matt and Juliet and our guidance department really taking ownership of the work and having real positive gains from that.
And I think build on that, our school psychologists working with our health teachers to implement mental health unit with their co-facilitating mental health classes also.
And the SAC too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The work that Danielle,
Yep.
that the SAC is doing as well is.
Yeah.
It's just so many examples. As we go through this, my mind just keeps jumping, and we were talking about school refusal and the challenges. Matt, we were walking through the hall the other day, and one of our mental health providers came up and was like thrilled. He was here today, this is what we did, and like, so like that level of partnership that's happening where right here, you're looking at that school refusal piece, you look at the interventions that are in place and the level of communication. And I witnessed Matt and one of our colleagues celebrating the student's success that day. So, Maria, your hand was up.
So, getting back to the question that I'm not sure who asked about, you know, the big spike this year on this graph. Not so much with Main Street School, it's steady incline. I know, Matt, you gave examples, but I feel a lot of those examples we're kind of seeing a lot every year. So in the high school, well, I guess for me, I'm not here, like I heard from you, Andrea, of some more of the domestic challenges, like you've seen an uptake this year. But I'm kind of wondering, like, what else is going on that, because this is kind of alarming to me, these huge spikes. And I don't know if it's even possible. Is it that within, you know, this year, for example, Dow's Lane, is there a way to see this graph in like the tiers? Like, is it you know, this is tier 1, this is tier 2, this is tier 3? You know, is it more that you're creating a lot more opportunities? There's a lot more like touch points in tier 2, in tier 1, for example, than ever before. So if that's happening, it wouldn't be as alarming as, for example, if you were to show me this
I think
chart
the first slide aligned
for Dow's Lane, for example.
with tier 1.
If that spike
Slide what?
was tier 3, you know, that would be, but I don't know if you're tracking it quite like
Not in that way.
Not in that way.
Not in that way.
I think
But-
that's a good Another way to ask it though is, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just wondering, is it, based on what you're saying, in Dow's Lane, is it skewing more towards the newer students, the kindergarten or first grade versus the second and third grade?
That's a good question. And
I'm just trying to think of the families, and I feel like it's been I feel like it's
Consistent, when I think of
consistent.
all the
Across the
students.
grades, because it's, I mean, I guess we're just trying, I mean,
Is
another
the new
another
families
thing that
or-
could be at play is that maybe you've changed your process and that's what we're seeing, the spike. That it's, right, like, you know.
Well,
When
not
you're,
to-
sorry, go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, but I think what you say there is true. I think our tier 1 has gotten stronger. So when we go back to the prior slide, where you see the drop-off, so remember, this is social worker.
Which side?
Keep going. Yeah, where we have student support issues. So where we see generally declines. So this is because this is just a
Here.
social worker context. So what other people are doing across the district is serving kids' needs here better. This may not mean that there's fewer issues.
Or
It may mean that they're being
identified.
addressed differently, which in some ways, we may look at this, and we had this conversation in one of our planning meetings with our school social worker, that she is able to be freed up only because that some of this is being handled, but we're seeing such a spike on the high end of some of these other concerns that out of necessity, that other people have to take ownership. So a level of preparedness and system support in it, but out of a level of necessity, I think teachers and other school-based folks are taking greater ownership here.
We talked about, and this is for a later conversation, you know, we talked about what's a day in the life of our social worker, but one of the things to get to before we get to some smattering of what our days look like is, right now our social worker is responsive, okay? So there is a smattering of tier 1, because they're helping and identifying students from a social, emotional, mental health standpoint that require a tier 2 and a tier 3. So that direct student support. Our social workers help guiding, setting up the system in terms of what is a tier 2 system going to look like, and then helping and who is identifying that role. So for most student support is going to be the school psychologists that are in that building because they're there every day. Our social worker and our school counselor are not at the elementary level, are not in buildings every day. So I think when you look at what is the tier 1 work of a district social worker whose needs are predominantly responsive and reactive, is building that tier 1. So that downward piece of student support, that's where that's coming from. So the tier 1 is working because they're identifying for the tier 2 and tier 3. Does that make sense?
Could I
Can I
ask?
just clarify something that I heard that you say, Dr. Harrison, is that, and combined with what you just said, Gail, is that other people are stepping in on the tier 1 and providing the support, because it sounds like the social worker is being pulled for more tier 3 issues.
2 and 3.
2 and
2 and 3.
That's absolutely right.
So that's why this is going down, but the reason why, meaning, sorry, the student support issue graph is going down, not because the need isn't there, but because someone else is handling it, because in this chart of family support and outreach, there's such a spike at the tier 2 and tier 3 level, which again goes back to my concern, what's going on?
So it's a little bit more than that. Can I, go ahead.
No, I would just want to make something clear. First of all, I just want to say to everyone in the room, this is like a county-wide issue, okay? Like, I don't want people to think of this as like, because it's starting to sound like, you're thinking, what's wrong in Irvington?
So there's a shift, that's what we're trying to.
No, I understand that, but I just want to say something because of my day job, like, this is county-wide, this is something we're talking about on a county-wide basis. I just want to lay that out there. But secondly, I want to say that it makes sense logically that you're going to have this kind of spike when we're talking about the family issues, because our people on the ground in our schools aren't really dealing with the families on a daily basis, nor should they be.
That was kind of my point, right? Like,
Yeah, so,
increase
so
that
that's
exposure.
really important for your 3 other graphs after graph 1.
And I think if we continue on and you see all 4 of the types of interactions, it'll give you a bigger picture of how some things are going down and some things are going
I
up.
just wanted
Can
to
I
add,
ask-
I just wanted to add to Maria's before I forget real quick.
Go ahead.
The idea that tier 1, if they're getting drawn to more tier 2 and tier 3 because tier 1 is being banned, right? That, to me, is a key point of this discussion and also a key observation from my end at least, that we're progressing in the right direction along the SEL work, because really, and I know one of the things that Castle does really well in particular is train teachers to be that first level of defense, not experts by any means, but to, the large bulk of situations created by social media, created by something that the middle school does well sort of naturally, as middle school teachers are really, right? But that's, I think, what, I think is a really good sign for me.
Yes, but no, because it's also, she's being pulled in another direction because the need is greater at the tier 2, tier 3.
So
No, hold on.
wait, can I,
Because I don't think that's what the data means. I think it means that, if you go back to the student piece, that number's down because issues aren't getting up to the social worker, not that she will get pulled in, it's that the staff is able to take care of that at tier 1.
It's the
But
tier-
Castle does
right.
really well. It trains teachers to,
But it's-
prevention is
Seeing the right-
the best, what is this phrase? Prevention is the best form of
Medicine.
Yes.
So-
whatever it is.
But also make sure, remember that Gail used the word that the social worker is being reactive.
responsive, responsive.
Sorry, responsive. So in other words, well,
So,
Can I, oh.
And
Aaron
wait,
just
I
got
just
her
wanna-
hand
Aaron
up
is
for 5
just-
minutes. Can we give Aaron a shot?
Well, I just
here?
want to hear just one thing, and sort of piggybacks off of what Juliet said. So we're talking about being responsive, and I do wonder how we're more preventative of some of these things. And I think that's what Maria is trying to get at, as to why is there a spike, so we can understand what the issues are. Is there a way we can prevent them? When we talk about the master schedule and maybe alleviating some of the SEL issues, a few of us went to a meeting about later start times at the high school as perhaps being one method of alleviating some of these SEL issues, because a later start time may be beneficial to our students. So I just hope that that component of how we can also help to prevent some of these things is also on the table. And then one other thing I was thinking of, and I don't know how it fits in to our staffing model, but I had read some articles about some districts that have peer mentoring or peer support solutions as well as part of their SEL program. And so I don't know how that fits into this as well.
But-
the
Yep.
investment that we're making into
And
this and.
when you think about what is mental health first aid, all of these things that are driven by the state and all of these things, everyone plays a role in that. And responsive and reactive, I did say reactive also, but responsive was the first word I used to describe what our social workers' work is. But I don't want to minimize the role the social worker is playing in helping our buildings devise what is our system for supporting students through the tiers, when tier 1 with our teachers and our school counselors may not be enough, right? So I think that is what was trying to get at. Maybe didn't
I
explain it
don't want to hold
clearly.
this up any.
Allison, we didn't hear too much yet about middle school. Did you?
Well, I just want to, like, agree with the point made that the student support issues are not going down. They are escalating. But I can speak from the middle school, like, we definitely have a team approach. And so the counselors, the psychologists, we're all working together to address issues. And then, we'll tap the social worker, when we need her.
Which is, I think, what the graph is showing, because the graph is showing you the social workers' interactions, not
The others.
all of the interactions.
There's so many other interactions that are not on this graph, for the reason.
And is there anything in particular that you think is different this year than in past years, or it's just more of the same?
We've been having a lot of conversations at our building in conjunction with PBS, because we're sort of overwhelmed right now with just the sheer number of referrals that are being submitted.
And the
daily.
intensity.
And just past few days at the middle school, and some serious, things that have happened with kids that are just, that have involved family outreach and students in crisis, that I'm very taken, like, just a high level of concern. And just, it seems like every day, it's this, the unexpected, and it's concerning.
And I think when we think about the work and the partnership that the buildings and PPS and our social worker have, is, Gina and I were at a conference jointly together, and I got a phone call. She also got a phone call, and I had stepped out, and I went like, come here, we need to talk. And literally, we were on the phone with Allison for about 7 minutes trying to strategize, and our school psychologist to really build what are those pieces, because it was going to touch a couple of different points. So when you talk about, there's a level of intensity of need sometimes, and we talk about some of the students at the high school, and you see that spike, it's very hard to capture what intensity looks like. So we could talk about a time intensity, right? And we could talk about a risk assessment can take, and I'll talk about what those are. That, when we talk about data and some of the issues with data, that is one of those things. It is very hard to capture a time. So that 10-minute conversation that we had with Allison today is going to result tomorrow in several conversations in time just around one component. Does that make sense? So I don't know that intensity can be captured within this.
Yeah, before we move on, I think Maura has a burning question.
Well, it's not a burning question, but I think that in a question on the,
Can you just reference what slide?
I'm going to do that now. I realize I noted down that I was hoping for a public definition of IEP mandated parent training, and also for those who may be in a position not to know what the Bulldog Family Fund is.
Sure.
What those things are, and I would only add, maybe now, so that I can let you continue, that the economic piece of this is something that we talked about last year. When we talked about the social workers' work, but I think that it connects to what Chris has pointed out, which is that there is greater economic need in Irvington than there was before, and that we can't, when we say, why is this happening, that's certainly a piece, you can't divorce those things.
So, go through IEP what IEP mandated parent training is. So under IDEA, students that have a classification of autism should receive parent training. So parent training can take many forms for that, but it is about helping students be successful, behavioral management, hygiene. It could multifaceted. So those are targeted. Sometimes they're written as monthly, quarterly. So it can be grouped or individual sessions where families are meeting with our social worker to go through particular topics. So they are parent-driven topics at times, and then obviously there are other components. So we talk about at a certain age, parent training will involve helping getting families ready for what's called OPWDD. So it's Office of People with Developmental Disabilities. So there's a meeting around that. So those last, usually they're an hour in duration. So those are various topics that happen. So the reason our social worker has switched to doing the parent-mandated IEP parent training is, again, the fluidity of what a social worker does in terms of that homeschool connection and really helping families gain those tools they need for their student to be as successful as they can be, both in school and out of school. And then, Bulldog Fund, thank you. So Bulldog Family Fund is based on our students that have free and reduced lunch. So as Chris has talked about in past years, the demographics of need has changed over time. So what's involved with the Bulldog Family Fund is students that are identified through the free and reduced lunch. There are many components of support that a family can get. Holiday meals, coats, support with the book fair, pictures, bless you, many components, the day-to-day life of Irvington student.
So Gail, if I may interject, I would say that to go further, that we need to give credit to the PTSA and their partnership, because they do a number of fundraising campaigns throughout the school year. We also have a great partnership with the Village, where there's support there at the Department of Recreation that assists families in need. But it's literally those needs from a trip to putting food on the table and a winter coat and a backpack, that families that can't provide those needs. Generally, those that we have outreach to are those initially, right, the letters that go out are to those students, free and reduced lunch. So mindful, that's just over 8% of our student population. So when we think of the affluence that exists here in Irvington, the affluence in Westchester, think about that we have nearly 10% of our students that their families are living at or below a poverty level.
The federal poverty.
Yeah, I was going to say federal poverty level, and those are the families that are willing to self-identify.
Right.
There's other folks that choose not to do so. So think about that, 10% of the families in the community. So we've seen that number increase dramatically, right, from 3 to over 8% in the 8 years that I've been here. But we've also seen the overall wealth of the community increase. So that what's happened is, right, the gaps are getting bigger. But we don't, I want to say, though, that where we reach out to those families with free and reduced lunch, there's also many other families that don't fall into that pool that get folded in, that we provide support for as they surface, whether through this process, the partnership with a communication with a teacher, whatever the case may be.
So that's where you're seeing Tier 2 with staff collaboration, is where that staff might be identifying students that are in need of support from the BFF. So that's where you'll see that. Sorry, I cut you.
I would just say that to me, this is the most important, because when I focus this conversation in my head outside of just social work and SEL, the goal always around all this stuff is student achievement, right? And so like this is, to me, a key cog in whatever level students can achieve, that they can best be set to achieve, right? If this kind of stuff is happening.
How do we get a kid ready to learn, available for learning?
Available
to learn, right, is terminology we use all the time in our field, right? So that availability to learn, if they don't, their toe is bursting through the front of their sneaker, right? And
But they didn't eat breakfast.
They didn't have breakfast.
Right?
That's that was
Maslow.
Maslow. I couldn't think of the name. Thank you.
Hierarchy of needs.
I was like, wait, I'm drawing a blank. So,
Can I
when you
just
see.
add I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one other thing. Earlier, Dr. Harrison mentioned the word trust, and Maria, you were looking at family outreach, and now we're looking at other components of meeting students, like in the basic needs. I think the word trust is important to note, and a positive thing is a destigmatization of both mental health and social emotional challenges and financial ones. So I think because our social worker and staff have cultivated relationships and trust, as you said earlier, because that trust exists, and because we as a community, both here and beyond, and I'm sure, Beth, you were talking about kind of your experiences during the day and in your work. So as a society, I'm grateful to say we've destigmatized a lot of this. I'm also grateful to say in the observations and the conversations I've been a part of with our social worker and other support staff, the trust that's been cultivated here with our staff, with families, is incredible. I think that's a testament to and part of an explanation as to why some of those numbers have risen as well.
And it's great hearing you say that after 7 months in the district.
Yeah.
And one of the things I would just say when we talk about the staff and collaboration, there was a middle school student that was identified. They're not through their first level of identification. I think it was a guitar that they were going to take lessons. And some behind-the-scenes staff work between our social worker and the music teacher. Believe it or not, a guitar just happened to appear 2 days later for that student to use. So I think the privacy, the trust, the in-depth work around it is where students are accessing it, and that student is very happy taking great lessons. So
I just want to repeat a statistic to expand on what Dr. Harrison was saying, which is there's the 8% free and reduced, which is based on a federal number. But United Way did a study called the ALICE, which looked at, as you were saying, as our district gets, the population gets wealthier, there's a segment of it that's falling behind because the cost of living here are also becoming more challenging. And so the number that they have put on our district and many like ours around the area, but specifically to Irvington School District, is that about 30% of the population is struggling to get by, and they're not at that federal number.
Correct.
Because that federal number is way too low.
Way low for our region.
It's way too low.
Okay. SNAP is a different program.
That's right.
So, in our next category is staff collaboration. So we touched upon it a little bit where BFF would sits in that tier 2. And then we look at what tier 3 is the coordination with staff on response to risk assessments and the facilitation between school personnel, county agencies, and families, so that student is coming back to a successful learning experience.
And those bullets, and I'd say in particular, the risk assessment it speaks for itself, but that second bullet there, and as you can imagine, if you were to go through the backup doc that we have, we just really highlighted a number of points here, but a school social worker brings in a tremendous resource set and connection to outside sources that continuously the social worker is introducing families to county services and helping bring services into the house, help them get insurances, help them get transportation, getting resources to provide other types of therapies, whatever the needs are in the house. But that is huge, and that's an expertise that comes with a social worker.
Correct. Mary?
And here, again, you can see a spike in the social workers' interactions in terms of that staff collaboration, particularly at the high school level.
And then crisis management. Crisis management, obviously from the title, there is not a tier 1 component. But when we look at tier 2 and tier 3, when we talk about home interventions, those are for our most significant cases of students that have debilitating school avoidance. Our social worker is going to the home on a regular basis. Developing safety plans, so we might conduct a risk assessment and not found to be in imminent harm, but yet they are developing a safety plan for that family, for that student. And then how do we coordinate what that safety plan is and all of those components. And then ultimately, finally, our contact and coordination with Child Protective Services, and Chris talked about how all the change of what CPS is and what we used to think about it, and how that all filters, and the work involved in what is a CPS call.
So Gail, as you transition to the next slide, and maybe I want to come back and Beth put you on the spot a little bit. When we look at what's happening in that tier 3 in the crisis management field, the trends that you see that are across, we want to say the county, the state, the nation, are startling and should have us all scared. Whether that is the level of severe depression and anxiety that has students completely paralyzed, the amount of self-harm that occurs, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts is off the charts. And we're seeing more levels of intervention, high school, middle school, than I think we've ever seen before. And so when I think about the conversations that I have with my colleagues, the workshop that I just went to, my own son's experiences of what's happening in other schools, the stories are just staggering and overwhelming for what is happening on this front.
And where the law fits in
Can
this.
I ask a question, though, because when we look between middle school.
I'm sorry, I can't hear
I'm
you.
sorry. Mike, when we look between middle school and high school, we're looking like at a factor of, we're going at over double in terms of the context. So I kind of would prefer, that's something that we need to tease out and talk about a little bit, and I wonder if possibly it's because when you do your push-ins, are they mostly through health classes? And is it that in middle school, you've got 3 years of that as an availability out of 3 years of school? Right, because you've got, yeah, and then once you get to high school, you've got half a year, 1 out of 4 years? Or is it push-in in other ways? I'm just wondering. No, but we talked about how certain things involving student support impact the other things that happen that aren't related to
So
student
our
support.
psychologist is only going in at the high school health classes. It's not currently the model in which we're using for middle school. No.
The mental health unit, that's
That's
correct.
just
For the
mental health.
counseling, the counselors are pushing in at all grade levels and in various classes,
In various
sometimes through English, sometimes through social studies, sometimes through PE.
That's happening at middle school
Okay.
as well.
Well, in middle
Counselors
school,
are.
the students are taking health every year. so
Correct.
Yeah,
they're
so
getting
they have that
extra
opportunity.
health teacher, which I think is what you were.
That's what I'm asking about, because, there's this correlation between how much student support we're providing, and, yeah.
Yeah, certainly correlate there, but when you come back to the national data that I shared in the beginning, that study focused specifically on our teenagers and the level of stress and anxiety that our teenagers are seeing, and it being exponentially increased over those different periods of the 3 years they measured. And you just kind of lay those 3 slides right over this slide
Yeah.
and think about the spikes that we're seeing. It makes sense right here for the teenage years.
I had a question that from earlier, but continues into here, is that, Matt, you had mentioned as some possible underlying causes, one of them being social media. I don't know, this is so early, I don't know if the middle school will be prepared to sort of reflect on that, but what is your lens into observing the stress or pressures that come from social media and how you observe it in the school? And I just wonder, with the transition to one-to-one, if you're seeing any shifts at the middle school, and whether you see it in a similar way to Matt at the middle school, and is there a shift at all when you start to implement one-to-one in terms of social media?
They're not supposed to be accessing social media during the school day. The reality is, many have social media accounts that they're on outside the school day, so that it is on their radar in terms of like what they're not part of or how they're viewing themselves. So I definitely feel we have situations where kids are upset by things on social media that come back to us, and we obviously follow up on. So it's an ever-increasing concern at the middle level too, because more and more students now have phones, and then they have to. It's very rare now for a student to say to me like, "Oh, I'm not allowed to have an Instagram account," or something, right? My parents.
At the age of 9.
Right, but that's more and more uncommon. I don't hear that and now most of our 6th graders even have a phone, so they're.
And so, but theoretically, they're not supposed to have
Have
their
their
phone at
phones.
school. Does that change anything about the dynamic of social media or provide any, I mean, obviously, the one-to-one is instructional resource, equity, but one of the other pieces was about not bringing phones into middle school.
So Allison, would it be fair to say that the pressures and the pressure and the stressors associated with social media influences still exist, because of what you said, but what we've done is we've kind of hit the pause button on the escalation of it during the school day. So we would have, something happened at night, and how many times did you, David, and I talk that there were 5 or 6 new steps to it that happened during the school day, that we've kind of hit that pause. You're dealing with what happened outside of school, not what's going on during
So
school.
there's not like a viral experience happening around you in the school. You have that window.
Yeah, and then.
Even if it's happening outside of the school day, it is still going to impact the students' ability to be available to learn.
But I guess what you're suggesting is that there's an opportunity to manage it without it continuing to escalate in school.
It's.
One of the reasons for the one-to-one was that phones
Yeah.
really just never be used, because we found in the past using phones for educational, academic purposes is, great, but it's hard for a middle schooler to then know, okay, now I'm using my phone to look something up.
But I'm
part of
really
my
doing it.
research, I'm tempted by, the Instagram. I mean, it happens to adults, so why not children, right? So having it a little bit more out of sight, out of mind, it can
So what's going to be interesting when you look at, as you talk about trend data, right? So as the board is aware that there's some data that's being pulled together currently for the middle school and an overview doc that's going to be shared with the board at the end of the week. When we look at the evolution of the program and growing to the high school year by year, and what the effect becomes when we hit finally, 4 years from now, potentially, that if we have a one-to-one model throughout the entire middle school and high school, how does it change the culture on that front? And I think what it does is makes things during the day a little bit more manageable because of the escalation, right, Matt?
I think that's true. I was sort of making notes myself. I guess a couple of things I wanted to say. When I first came to the district 3.5 years ago, very excited to hear about the BYOD policy on campus and that teachers were finding innovative ways to use cell phones in the classroom. I think 3.5 years later, what I'm seeing in the classroom is teachers much more reticent to allow students to have access to their phones because it is a great distraction. Actually asking for administrative support to put things in place, shoe racks to keep their phones, because I think students are having a hard time.
Another shout out to the
Yonder.
BTSA.
Thank you very much. So there's a lot, like the social media comes from a lot of different angles. So there's that FOMO idea that, people are doing things I'm not a part of. And certainly students talk about that. And actually, in a recent CBF training session, our students were talking about how even more than FOMO, there's this notion
Just to clarify the acronym that CBF, do you want to define what the program is?
Character Building Facilitators, a program that we run between the high school and middle school, where high school students come in and deliver some character building lessons at the middle school level.
That's nice.
It's excellent. Allison and I have formed a good partnership there. So I think that the other thing they talk about is how even more than FOMO, there's just this notion that everybody else's life appears so Instagram polished and clean, and mine is such a mess. And I'm so very aware of what I'm not experiencing. So there's that thing. And then another piece of the social media comes through conversations about anxiety that's provoked by checking my grades online and making sure I need to know exactly what my score was. I have my test third period, 7th period now, the test isn't posted yet. I don't know my number. That's generating a concern. And then I guess I'm struck also by the fact that there were so many instances in my first 2 years of online sort of digital bullying that took place. And I'm telling you, I haven't seen it at all. But I think it's shifted away from that. I think the negativity has gone a different direction now. Now it's not so much I'm going to come directly at you to make you feel sad. Now I'm going to show you pictures of what you don't have. And I think that's it.
The way
And I think
grown-ups
it-
do it, you mean?
It has evolved, but you know what's really interesting? One thing that we haven't mentioned, and I know this, we're talking about social workers and social emotional learning in school. This is such a great opportunity. I actually want to take a moment for us all to thank our partnership, or your partnership as a district with, I get the names of the acronyms, ICAB, ASK.
I ask CAB.
But it's all the same.
Irvington About Safe Kids.
Thank you. No, because there's a really great there's a really good example of going back to collaboration with families, right?
Yeah.
Where it's a positive thing. Look, I'm going to say this actually more for the video camera than for anybody in this room, because I'm fairly certain everybody in this room understands this. This is a parent problem as much as it is a classroom problem. And until we say that out loud and confront that issue, we're going to have a problem. And what I mean by that is, we have parents who provide their children with access to social media before they're supposed to, or ready to, or even if they are of the age, they're not mentally mature enough to handle it. There's the most important one that they all have, FOMO, what is it, FOMO? It's Snapchat. Now, I don't know about you, but Snapchat has one goal: to deceive.
Yeah.
And yet we provide our parents, as parents, we provide our kids with access to the ability to deceive us. And therefore, it runs rampant. So in partnering with the schools, I think we need to really ramp that up tremendously. And I know people have personal choice and they can do what they want and all, but to ignore the fact is silly. So what we do with it is another thing, what people want to own to and so forth, but we have to really aggressively work with parents on how to best parent kids, right? And then when schools partner with them, there's a lot of sense making, right? As opposed to the disconnect that often happens, like,
I mean, I would say in response to those, the schools, because the kids are all here, And because you're negotiating it with them, creates those norms. And when you have rules in school, that allows the parents to then say, hey, that's the norm, this is what's gonna be for our family. So I think it's a relationship.
100%.
Just maybe to pivot and play off David's comment, when we think about IAS-CAB, the level of services that are delivered, right, are multifaceted. There's lots of layers of pushing that happen in the school day, right? So we have experts like Ty Sells that are coming in and working with our kids, right? And we've had like 2 different rounds of I think this year so far.
Love it.
Of experts coming in to work directly with our children
Another
in
one
the
in
classroom.
April.
And then we look till tomorrow night where we have another renowned expert coming in to speak in our community at the Irvington Public Library at 7 p.m. I hope you all be there. But like those levels of resources, but really the conversation that we had this morning, I'm looking to Juliet and then the audience to Tanya, that the conversation this morning was how do we fold opportunities of IASK programming to start to connect with these types of needs that are surfacing in the school district. And that was part of our conversation this morning. So, you know, we have great partners in this work. So when we reference where we are, you know, today obviously I've just spoken about IASK-CAB and the work that's done there. Shout out to the PTSA multiple times tonight. The work that we do in this room, when we think of partnership with the faculty, staff, administration, the Board of Education, can't ignore the Irvington Police Department and the work that they did in performing welfare checks, going to homes, helping do risk assessments that are beyond a social worker. So I'll let your imagination run with some of those scenarios. And then all the county agencies that come in and support our children and their families that really trickle through all the different tiers of intervention that we've discussed. So when we think about how does the school system support these social, emotional, and it was very deliberate, like we wrote the word human needs, because it comes down to like those basic needs when we talk about survival, right? These are things that we're looking to address here in our school. So when we do that, we've kind of illustrated all the different ways that we approach this. We tried to do so in a much more concrete way than we've done in the past to outline not only and define what the tiers of supports are, but the different roles that we play and realistically the effects that we have here in our school district. So that said, when we think about moving forward, we still have, when we look at the bottom 3/4 of this slide, we're still in a position where we're not seeking to increase our school psychologists. We're still in a position, and we understand that like growth in this area has got to be a progression. I can tell you that we would love to say we want another elementary school counselor because of the great work that's happening on the SEL front. But when we look at the budgetary resources available to us, and you know, so we're looking, this is foreshadowing next week's presentation already, that when we look to this, there's only so much room. And so when we're thinking about priorities, this is about human needs, right? The idea of the social worker is human needs. Think food, clothes, access to their education, and the overall mental well-being. And if anything, go to that very, very tip of the pyramid and think about those students and families that we're impacting at so many different levels. We got to put our money somewhere. It truly needs to be in the investment in a second social worker. So in looking at this, we've had multiple conversations as an administrative council. Mary, Gail, and our current social worker and I have had some really difficult conversations about the different models, how this would best play out. We really believe that to have the impact, and come back to that Venn diagram, think of all the different tiers, right? Overlap of SEL, the social work services, how a social worker fits into the tiers of supports, that we really need to have social workers that are really focused in supporting our schools and being tied to the schools. Now, surely there may be some nuanced situation or a crisis situation where it's all hands on deck, or because of a relationship that happened in the elementary school, we may want to support at a secondary school. We believe that we'll best serve our students' needs, we'll best support our staff members by having one social worker that's more dedicated at the elementary level, one that's dedicated at the secondary level. Right now, we have the luxury of having an amazing, amazing social worker that I don't even want to say that anybody could snatch up, but she wants to be here because she loves Irvington and working with all of us and your children. That she is so flexible and so talented that she could work in either scenario. She could work in secondary environment, the elementary environment. When we go through a search process, I think we're going to be looking at the skill set that someone brings in, and we want to hire the best available, most talented social worker to support our needs here in Irvington. So with that said, if we find somebody that's got a tremendous skill set at the elementary school, we would want to hire that to strengthen our team, and we would look to have our current staff member work in the secondary environment, or we could reverse that scenario. We just have the good fortune of having a superstar working with us now that would have that level of flexibility. And I got to tell you, she is totally anxious about, if this comes to fruition, about where she lands, because she's developed so many tremendous relationships across the district. She doesn't want to turn her back on anybody. But at the end of the day, when we look at where we are, this is the structure that we would look to present for next year. Continuing, again, with the level of psychology support that we have. When we think about numbers and enrollment, I just want to throw an asterisk out for Main Street School, that our Main Street School psychologist also manages our out-of-district placements. So when you think about like caseload, there's also responsibilities that extend beyond the school, our counselor structure that we have, and then the continuation of our current student assistance counselor. So that said, and we've done, I think, effectively a lot of Q&A throughout the workshop.
Yeah. I just had one thought, particularly because I won't be here next week for the continuing conversation, so I'll just put it out there now. I really appreciate this discussion. I am convinced, I was last year, but even more so now, about the need to add a social worker. But I also think I want to make sure that our discussions, and I'm sorry I can't be here for the next one, are making those connections. I mean, Aaron, you did it with, there's a lot of interest around start time, and the stories we heard from other schools about the impact is tremendous. And to be a part of the discussion today around the master schedule at the high school is also, I mean, the social worker is responsive to concerns, and if we don't change structures and the way we do school, we're just responding rather than, finding long-term solutions. So I really want to stress how important it is that we keep our eye on that as well. And as much as I'm a proponent of stakeholder conversations, they tend to bring out a certain type of parent or student, I have to say. And so it's also, when we talk about data, it's about having different types of data. So stakeholder is important, but as a high school, you have other data and you have other experiences that show you that those stressors are real, and that we have to be responsive to that. And I would expand that, as I did today, to the middle school as well.
Yeah, and just to add to what when you refer, I know stakeholder involvement is important to the board. A lot of people in this community truly does not understand CAB and IAS, the difference in what they do. I think the two chairs of that committee, the village, and the adults in that committee really do make the kids who sit on that committee feel very safe. And we've got great kids on that committee who provide really good feedback to the adults in the room. And I think that is also another piece of how the building principals and administration hear from the kids. It's just, these are all, we're hearing all different examples, they're all pieces, and it all works together. There's no one answer, just like we're investing in this castle visit. That's just another attempt, because we all recognize this is not just an Irvington thing, this is a national issue. The stress is real. There are a lot of things going on in everyone's lives, and sometimes I think CAB and IAS people just don't get that, but kids are on that committee and they have a voice and they are heard.
And I would say it's getting stronger in the last couple of years.
And I wanted to piggyback on something Michael said, because Mary Ellis was also at the late start time presentation, along with Ms. Bernstein and Mr. Hanna and myself.
And I do think that the executive team had suggested that we present out to the full board and the administration at a future meeting about some of the major findings that came out of that, including a direct correlation between mental health of secondary students and later start times. And a number of superintendents, well, maybe 2 or 3 from different districts did report. And I guess I will share with everybody, we have the PowerPoint available. So
Maybe if you could share that with the.
we'll share that with everybody immediately. It's available through the Regional School Boards Association. I'll send it out tonight.
At our next meeting when we have our committee updates, that's where I was gonna ask for that report.
So we'll definitely get that ready.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and I want to thank my colleagues and for your flexibility, because as we know, this was rescheduled from a few weeks ago when I was taken ill along with a couple others. I won't look to my left. But it was right here. Yeah.
Run.
14 days
I already
have passed, so we're okay now. But I want to thank my colleagues for your flexibility, because this affected your lives and your families on 2 different nights because of what you had planned before. So I want to thank you, and your contributions, as always, were excellent and make our district proud of the work that you and your faculty and staff do each day.
Absolutely. Thank you for carrying.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes.
everyone, for
Always a
the
pleasure.
discussion. Any last questions before we let everyone leave?
Have you have community?
Yeah, well, yeah. I saw everyone else packing up there too. So. This is time where we have an opportunity for community comment.
Anything you want to say?
Going once, going twice.
They want to go.
Sold.
All right.
So our next meeting is here, actually next Tuesday,
We'll see all of you Tuesday.
7:30.
We'll collect them.